was in kindergarten when my pregnant mother and I moved into a house. On one side of the house was an old warehouse. On the other side, a slightly run-down home with some slightly shady people living there. I was told to stay away, for a good reason as it turned out. We came home on more than one occasion and found the attic door open, which was in my mom's closet as well, as things being slightly rearranged. Of course, my mother was disturbed. As my bedroom faced the warehouse, it was not lighted outside. My mother's was from the streetlights. I kept hearing strange noises outside my window, and after a few times of refusing to sleep in my own room, she decided to sit in a chair in the front of the large window in my bedroom, which had sheer curtains. One night while looking out, coffee in hand, she heard the same noises I was hearing. To her horror, it was one of the neighbors next door. When he saw her watching back at him, he took off after giving her a cynical smile. That very same night he stabbed and mutilated a woman at the laundromat, just half a block from our home. Needless to say, we were out of that house. Needless to say, we were out of the house that very night. Thankfully, he's still in prison and will be there for the rest of his life. Let's not meet, ever. I'm a 24-year-old girl who is an ex-heroin addict, and I've been clean for a year and a half. I grew up in a privileged home in a major city, but got into drugs when I was only 13. My life went downhill for the worst when my dad died, and I got hooked on heroin. I had been a heroin addict for 4 years by the time in this story, and I was living a life of drugs and crime. I had just separated from my boyfriend and was hanging out with drug dealers to pass the time. Literally sleeping wherever I could when I was hanging with this guy. This guy's name was Frenchie. He figured he could use me to do a drug pickup at a pharmacy with a fake script. I was so tweaked out and paranoid at the time that I flat out refused. He got so mad that he kicked me out of the car and drove off with all my shit. Being that I had nothing, my phone was dead and my life was in shambles in the worst possible way. I was crying in a random parking lot when this young mid-20s, tall Asian guy came up to comfort me. Guys always wanted to save me because I was an attractive woman, and it was a real example of being a damsel in distress. So this guy says he will help me, and since I have nothing at all, no money, no clothes, and nowhere to call home, I was desperate and agreed to let him take me to my house. He seemed really nerdy, but I was a drug addict and my judgment was totally wrong. I just wanted to shower and assemble my life in any way I could. So we get into his car, and he ends up driving to a town outside the city more than an hour away. So I started to get sketched out. We got to his place, and he lived with his mom, and when we got there he just started talking to her in another language and told me I could take a shower. Now before I got in the shower, he told me to leave my phone outside the bathroom. Huge red flag. I proceeded to tell him it was dead and that wasn't necessary. So I went to the bathroom and proceeded to take the quickest shower ever. I literally rushed out of my clothes, let the water run over me, and got out. As I was rushing to get my clothes on, he jimmies the lock and comes in his boxers, and I literally scramble out of there and grab my stuff and run outside. We were in a locked complex, and he came after me and said what was wrong. Why are you running away? I proceeded to tell him I was having a panic attack and needed to get high, and that he needed to take me to the store so I could get foil to smoke my drugs on. He then locked me in his car and drove through a wooded area, began to lecture me on why I can't use drugs anymore, if we were going to be together. I told him I need to wean off the drugs, and that I'm having a massive anxiety attack, and that he needed to get me to the store or the hospital quick. So he reluctantly took me to the store, told me to stay in the car, and then he went inside. I ran out of the car into the restaurant next door and grabbed the waitress and told her to meet me in the bathroom, when I proceeded to tell her the story about the guy trying to abduct me. Luckily, she told me there was a police officer at the bar with his wife. I proceeded to give them a report of the events. They found him lurking for me outside the restaurant. They arrested him and took me all the way home over an hour away. Needless to say, this is right before I got sober. My life is nothing like this today. Today I have a good job and support myself, and don't do drugs or associate with people who do. But creepy Asian guy, let's never meet again. So this is one of my first experiences I remember that has made me the paranoid person I am, always listening to my instincts. Years ago, when I was still a preteen, one of my mom's old school friends came to visit. So we decided to go shopping and then grab lunch. While out shopping, my mom diverts into this shoe store and is purposefully staying away from the windows, taking out shoes on the shelves, getting me to try them on even though I don't need any school shoes. My mom's friend asked her what was going on. My mom explains away from me. She says, let's not scare the child. After a half an hour to an hour, we are basically sat bored with my mom walking to the front and back every so often. A store clerk came up to us to then check on us to see if he could help. This is when I finally overhear what was going on. We were being followed. A man had been following us for 15 minutes before my mom pulled into this store. While waiting for us to exit to resume following us, my mom had seen him playing with a large knife. She thought she was getting away from a pickpocket, but it was so much worse. The store clerk then took over my mom's job of checking the front of the store to see if he was gone. Over half an hour later, he finally got bored and left. 2 hours later, we left to be safe he wasn't laying in wait somewhere. This was the time before cell phones, and the store clerk couldn't call the police because technically, a crime hadn't been committed. My friends never get why I'm so paranoid or cautious. Possibly the reason why I've had a bit more encounters than I care for, as my friends simply write it off as weird when all my alarm bells are going off and I want to run away. I ran into Let's Not Meet while I was browsing Reddit on my lunch break last week. When I first joined Reddit, I enjoyed no sleep, but when I realized those stories aren't real, I lost complete interest. I find the honest stories much more interesting. Reality is almost always more terrifying. I have a story of my own, and it's something that has shaped the way I raise my son, how protective of him I am to this day. The reason I didn't have children until I could make my home a fortress. It's a story that changed the way my own mother parented my sister and I, and something I feel thankful every day didn't go any further than it did. I was 5 years old. My family moved to a small town in eastern Tennessee from Baltimore City Center because my dad had been laid off. They were pregnant with my baby sister, and my mom wanted to start anew, closer to her family in a more rural area, better suited for raising kids, or so she thought. My mom's sister, my teenage cousin, and her parents all lived in the same neighborhood that this house was on, and this house was on a cul-de-sac that had just went up for rent. My grandparents agreed to rent it for my parents until my dad could get on his feet and find work. It was a quiet neighborhood with a big yard in the back, but a very steep hill in the front. We had large steps that led up to the front door from the gravel driveway below and a covered porch. Underneath those steps was a little storage area that the porch hung over, and a door to a small basement that only spanned about the living room, which sat atop. When I Google map the house now, it's completely closed in, but 30 years ago it was only closed in right under the steps, and obviously in the basement. For anyone who wants to see the house, I can provide a photo if you need to visualize. A couple of years passed and nothing significant happened. My baby sister was getting ready to turn 2, and I was 7. My dad had gotten a decent job as a warehouse manager at the paper company, and would work during the day while my mom stayed home. Almost every day my grandmother and aunt would walk over, and while they were inside talking and having coffee, my sister and I would usually go outside on the front porch and play with dolls, or I'd read to her on the swing while my mom had her conversation. Usually they would migrate out to the porch and spend time with us on the porch swing until it got later in the afternoon, and everyone would go home to start dinner. One afternoon, the neighbor's daughter Nikki was over, and we were playing on one of those mats with tracks on it and my Hot Wheel cars, lying down on our chests while we pushed the cars around. I noticed out of the corner of my eye a small twig sticking up from a hole at the other end of the porch near the swing. I sat up and asked Nikki if she saw it too. She was a little older and knew my cousin well, so she says, "Yeah, it's probably Devin messing with us." So we go over to it and pull. Except when we did that, whoever it was below pulled the twig back harder and gave me a splinter and made me fall. Pride wounded, I got my sister and went in to tell my mom, and Nikki went home. I'm not sure why I didn't mention this twig incident to my mom that day, to be honest. Maybe I thought it would get my cousin in trouble. Maybe I was spooked. Or maybe I was just 7 and careless. I just can't remember what I was or wasn't thinking. A couple days later, I was outside on the porch alone while my sister napped. I was painting on an easel I had gotten from my grandma. My mom was inside cleaning, and I noticed again a twig sticking up from the same place. Mind you, there were roughly 20-some odd steps up to our porch, so it's not like we were right on the ground. Someone had to be down there poking it through the hole. I walked over to it and got down on my knees and said, "Devin, you're not going to give me a splinter again. I'm telling my mom." And that's when whoever it was replied to me in almost a whisper, "I'm not Devin." His voice sounded so low and scratchy that I couldn't make it out, so I leaned down and looked through the hole. I didn't see anyone, so I said, "What?" And he said, "Come down here. I want to play with you." I said, "I'm telling." And he very angrily said, "If you tell anyone, I will get you." So I screamed, ran in, and I told my mom immediately. She came outside and looked all around but didn't see anyone. She called my dad at work and he came home early. They still didn't see anyone, but they did see the long twig under the porch and an old table that had been up against the house moved to the middle. I remember my mom calling my aunt and telling her to tell my cousin to knock it off and stop messing with us. But I figure my aunt never said anything. Otherwise, they would have known it wasn't him. About a week passed by and I had been so creeped out that I hadn't gone back outside at all. But time heals all wounds, I suppose. Because when Nikki called and asked if I wanted to come over to her house to watch Lion King and build a fort in the living room, I was all in. Her dad worked graveyard, so whenever her mom would go somewhere during the day, it was so much fun to hang out with her. Her dad would sleep and we would sneak and drink Coke and eat the candies with the jelly in the middle from her parents' office. As long as we were quiet, and I called my mom before I left so she could watch me walk back over, we had a lot of freedom on those days. My mom watched me walk over, and we built a fort to pretend we were lions while we watched the movie. We were about halfway through the movie when we heard a knock at the door. We knew we couldn't open the door or wake up her dad, so Nikki stood away from it and called out, "Who is it?" thinking it may have been my mom. We didn't see anyone's shadow through the curtain on the door, and we were too spooked to look when there was no reply. When they didn't knock again, we got back in our sheet fort and carried on. A few minutes later, we heard something under the house banging on the floor of the living room. Our houses were exactly the same layout, and the living room were directly over small basement areas. We screamed and ran to her dad's room to wake him up. He got up and got a baseball bat and went to look outside. When he went to look in the basement, the door was wide open, and it was obvious that someone had been living in there. At the time, I didn't know what they found. I just assumed he'd made a bed and was someone homeless. My mom rushed over and called the police. The cops took my statement from the previous week. As kids, we were kept out of the mix. There were whispers. We ended up moving to what is still my parents' current home a couple of months later. Nikki's family left that day and never stayed in their house again. It must have really screwed with them because I ended up hearing that they divorced and Nikki was arrested in early adulthood for something terrible. A few years ago at a family reunion, the story came up and my parents told my sister doesn't remember anything because she was too young, and I that when they opened the basement, there were thousands of child porn pictures scattered everywhere, and photos of us 3 girls playing on the porch, riding bikes, photos of other kids at the park. They ended up finding him and arresting him a few blocks away from our house that week. He was convicted of numerous sex crimes, including the rape of an 11-year-old girl in a neighboring city. So after lurking on this subreddit, I decided stories I could contribute, but I'll start off with this. I can't remember my age. I want to say I was in high school. I just called a buddy of mine over to hang out, probably play video games, ride bikes, go to another friend's house, or smoke pot. Who knows? Anyways, I'm in my house waiting for this kid, wondering where the hell he could be. He was that close friend where I would allow him to just come up to my door and literally walk in, so I'm in my room waiting. Finally, I hear my downstairs basement sublevel door open. It leads out to the garage, and I wondered how the hell he got in when my garage door was shut. I didn't really think much of it at first, to be honest. My buddy comes into my room and says, "Hey man, I just said hello to your dad and he didn't reply. He let me in your garage. It was really weird. Your dad always says hi to me. Although, my dad had left for work hours ago. I went outside and there my garage door was, wide open. The stranger long gone. Supposedly he saw my dad rummaging through his toolbox and fridge. When my friend said hi to my dad, he walked out of the garage facing the other direction so that my friend never saw his face. The guy never took anything, although I believe it was his intention, and I'm glad it was perfect timing that my friend showed up. Who knows what else this man could have been capable of.